Hello, Dr. Zane again. How are you? I wanted to make a few comments about the articles that you're reading for this week. Kind of give you an overview. Now, Dr. Dorsey has also done kind of the same thing in his lecture on the direct assessments. But it's always good to hear different perspectives. We don't differ, of course. We might just end up saying different things. So let's start with the Touchette article. It's a really good one for you to read. If you've heard of scatterplot, assessment, then you will appreciate this article. This is the first time it was discussed in the literature by Touchette and McDonald and Langer. Now, Becky, interestingly enough, um, works at NEC now in New England, and she's real hot on, she's the guru of our field on video modeling. And so it's kind of cool to see, like a billion years ago, she was working with Paul um, and developing the scatter plot. So if you have the article, then you'll note, if you read it already or have it in front of you, that on page 344 he gives the standard template for a scatter plot. They've gotten quite uh, specialized now, and there's different permutations of them. But the basic one is dividing a day or a period into briefer intervals of time, and then typically the columns would represent different stimulus conditions, um, events, things like that. And so I think you'll like reading the original research on this and seeing what Touchette et al. Have to say about that. Um, and again, it illustrates a nice direct assessment method that you will be using, okay, in your target individual. Now, the Grodin article, a few years later, Journal of Behavior Therapy and Experimental Psychiatry. Now, Jerry here started tweaking it a bit, all right? Now, you notice that in the little brief introduction that Jerry provides here, we talk about how to, we finally have come to the point where we need a thorough behavioral analysis prior to intervening, as Jerry quotes Canfor and Saslow, okay? But there's really has been not a serious attempt to do that. I think he quotes Touchette. I'm quickly scanning. Let me go to the reference section. Yeah, he cites Touchette. So he mentions Touchette, and Jerry goes on then, why we have you read his article, is Jerry goes on to provide more details on how to do a scatter plot. Now he's tweaked it a little bit. You'll see that there's a detailed behavioral report, which is um, his version of the scatter plot. On page 165, Jerry shows you his version of it, right? Still the same sort of thing, right? So the left-hand column, um, location of the incident, the activity, and notice, look at the antecedents. It's a social interpersonal, kind of sounds like attention, right? Organismic, affective, could be sensory, right? And then look at the distant antecedents. He's getting into motivational operations. We didn't know that term then, right? But that's what he's looking for. And then obviously the right-hand column is a space where to provide more detailed information. And then he goes on, the behavior checklist piece, further representation of a scatter plot. And then what Jerry adds in on page 168 is the detailed behavior report analysis, where it forces the reviewer to summarize and make some decisions about what the variables might be. So I like this one in that it's really the basic scatter plot, right? But he's modifying, he's morphing it, and that's what we do in our work. That's what the research does, right? It evolves, it tweaks, it pushes us forward, comes up with new ideas, new ways of doing things. That's the way good science should work. Now, the next article in the sequence for this week is by Mason Lally in '91. Now, this article is kind of cool for a couple of reasons, maybe three. One, we're working on a target that typically we haven't worked on much, which is that of bizarre speech. And I think he mentions that early on in his little literature review on page 553. We have found only 2 studies that experimentally analyze the reinforcement contingencies maintaining bizarre vocalizations. Now, you know, the traditional psychiatric or psychological view of bizarre vocalizations is that that is coming from a psyche, a psychosis or hallucinations or psychotic cause or explanation, right? But what do we behavior analysts think? You know, we adhere to our methods of science and our scientific perspective, right? And we also adhere to the environmental variables being the influences of behavior. So if we believe that, then bizarre speech is operant, unless it's proven to be medically induced, but no one has that proof, right? So we believe it's due to operant influences, right? So we got to give Mace and Lally some credit here to try to experimentally evaluate the treatment of bizarre speech. So that's an interesting piece, that looking at like new behavior that we typically don't look at. Secondly, you're going to see, or you have seen if you've read it, that they're again using descriptive analyses, more of an ABC, I believe. Let's Yes. Under procedures of descriptive analysis, they are looking at antecedents, consequences, more of a time flow rather than scatter plot type of data. And then the third thing that I like about this is that they start getting into what they don't call it conditional probabilities, but you're going to see that it's conditional probabilities. And lastly, it's just a nice application of using descriptive data to help predict the function, which is then confirmed through an experimental analysis. So that's what I really like about the Mace and Lally. I'd be interested in the forums if you discussing this concept of bizarre speech and looking at it from an operant point of view. Obviously, being a radical behaviorist, that's the way I would look at bizarre speech. We did a study a long time ago where this young teenage girl was diagnosed as Tourette's syndrome. She would swear a lot, okay, use profanity. After observing her informally for a while, we began to believe that it was more influenced by environmental conditions. So we conducted a functional analysis, the typical traditional FA experimental analysis. Come to find out that I think 99 or 98% of all swearing occurred in the demand condition, and virtually none in the other conditions, confirming to us that first the girl had control over the speech, and true Tourette's does not. And secondly, is it true Tourette's if it's maintained by escape from demands? Again, think of parsimony, right? We have 2 explanations for lots of swearing. One, it's Tourette's, this nebulous psychiatric sort of diagnosis, or 2, proof that it happens virtually only in demand conditions. You got to go parsimony, and from our operant point perspective, that certainly makes sense to us. So I hope you like the Mason Lally article. I think it's kind of cool. Now the next study is by Sasser et al. Use of descriptive and experimental analyses to identify the functional properties of aberrant behavior in school settings. A couple neat things about this study. First, now they're doing it in a school setting, not an analog, not an artificial room, not a institution or facility for persons with disabilities, but rather in the school setting, and they're working with teachers to implement these analyses. That's kind of cool. And functional analysis assessment has been slammed a lot because of our lack of proving it to be effective in more naturalistic settings like public schools being implemented by teachers, okay? As you know, most of the FA work has been done with persons with developmental disabilities by trained clinicians. And there's some studies out, and probably more are coming, where we can show that we can teach FAs to special ed personnel or other teachers, and that we can use them in school settings, and also, importantly, that we don't have to work just on maladaptive behaviors like self-injury, aggression, that sort of thing. We can use them for more school-type problem behaviors like maybe non-compliance, things like that. So I think you'll like the Sasso article for those reasons. It kind of starts getting us into schools, and we start using teachers. The other nice finding or characteristic of this study is that, again, it's further refinement of descriptive analyses, and again, it illustrates how we can use descriptive analyses to predict function. It also illustrates how we can check whether the function identified by descriptive is confirmed through an experimental analysis. Okay, so that's what's kind of cool about the Sasso article, and I hope you like that one. The next one, I believe, is by Lerman, right? Yes, good. Descriptive and experimental analyses of variables maintaining self-injurious behavior. Lerman's brilliant, as is Awada. And what I want you to read from this article, or take from this article, are a couple things. One, again, another study checking the correspondence between descriptive and experimental analyses. You know that the experimental functional analyses is the best prediction of function, most valid. Well, all the last couple authors and Lerman and Awada realized that we have to check on whether descriptive analyses, or that the function identified by descriptive analyses, is the valid one or the true one, and the best way we can check on its level of validity is by comparing the results to more of an experimental analysis, a determination of the function. So that's what one thing you'll pick out of this study, or you should appreciate. And the other one is that she mentions conditional probabilities in here, and I think illustrates exactly how to do it. So hopefully you'll like that one too. Now the Emerson one, I don't want you to panic too much about this one, particularly when you see on page, there's a formula in the Emerson one. Where did that go? Yeah, I don't know where it went, but there is a mathematical formula in there somewhere. And, oh, there it is on page 307. Don't panic. They're talking about time-based lag sequence analyses, and it's just a conditional probability. And I'll be talking about that in a special lecture. I have an assignment on it. It's really easy. It's simple. Don't freak out. It's going to be good. But the nice thing about the Emerson et al. Article here is that he does mention time-based lag sequence analyses. And again, it's more work. This article represents more work on how to do descriptive analyses and how to use that in this study on multiple topographies of challenging behavior. So looking at different topographies of behavior in different settings here, and how you can implement sequence analyses in the real world. And then I believe lastly, Kahn is looking at the scatter plot directly, kind of beginning with Touchet and ending with Kahn on the scatter plot analyses. And they are looking at what they call temporal distributions of the scatter plot, and I think you'll be very comfortable with what they're talking about here. So that's a bit of a review of the articles in this section. Again, I really like going back and having you read the original, or some of the original articles on this research, and I hope you appreciate the evolution of these methodologies. If you look at FA, it starts with the Awada 1 and 82, very precise and standardized protocol, 10 minutes long, blah, blah, blah. But as the years go on, we smart researchers start conducting little tests of different variations of it. Shorten the duration, do it in the real world, mess around with the EOs and the AOs. It's a beautiful example of how science progresses, and these articles represent that too, starting with Touchette and the very early on and, investigations of direct assessments and moving on through the years to refining those procedures and then testing how good are they to predict the functions and how good are they to help us actually solve maladaptive problems. So I hope you like them. Talk to you later. Goodbye.